Aujourd'hui, pour le thème de flow, on voulait traiter ça comme un état sensoriel rassembleur. Et pour parler de ça, on a décidé d'inviter un conférencier dont le travail finalement est de concevoir des expériences participatives qui allient quelque part l'art au design sensoriel. Et ce qu'il fait, c'est qu'il utilise la nourriture pour créer différentes couches d'expériences et permettre aux participants d'interagir entre eux. Alors s'il vous plaît, je vous demanderai de l'accueillir très chaleureusement. Nicolas Fonseca.
Bien, bonjour tout le monde. C'était très bien dit, Charlie. Je ne sais pas si j'ai besoin de faire une conférence maintenant. On l'a préparé en anglais ce matin, so making the switch now. My name is Nico, and actually it was great to have a little succinct introduction because I'm usually pretty bad about talking about my work, which is why I thought it was so appropriate to have the theme of flow today. So basically that's what I'm going to be doing, is kind of just flowing through different aspects that are related to my practice. I'll start by giving maybe just a bit of background about myself. So I come from a pretty structured background of filmmaking, and that gave me a taste for non-linear narratives. So that's when I kind of like started to get intellectually perverted by all of these like non-linear and experiential potentials, all of the shifts that we've been seeing in the last years. So from there I went into interactive installations, and somehow food got involved. And so I'm gonna spend the next, I guess, 20 minutes explaining how food got involved. This little project. So this is probably one of the first times that I started playing with food. This is a project called In the Mouth. It was presented about 5 years ago at the Phi Center. And it started out actually as a feature film script, and then we couldn't get it off the ground. Like film theaters were closing left and right. For some of you that are old enough, maybe you remember there was like about 10 film theaters on St. Catherine Street. And actually, we used to go to the movies and call it a date, something that we don't do anymore. So just a bunch of things were changing, and I think I had like a 13th version of the script, and at one point we were like, screw it. Let's just turn it into something that feels like the film, but that's not really fiction, and maybe we might even shoot a couple of scenes, have some actors in the room when we welcome people to this kind of like experiential supper that was based on this chef that lost his sense of taste, basically. So we kind of like ran with this fiction. I had actors playing chefs and chefs playing actors, and then a bunch of people in a room, and sent everybody some questionnaires 2 weeks ahead of time, where we asked people about foods that they hated the most, their latest food crushes, their favorite utensils. So it was all about kind of like going to people's food biography. And then we would make the food with these answers. And the most fun aspect, I guess, of the evening is that people had to talk to each other in order to know what they were eating, because the menus weren't printed. And I think I've done, I think I'm up to number 26 now, so all of the evenings for the past 5 years, those 25 evenings have been numbered. I have like all the numbered menus because they're all different. Let's say this was the main meal, which was called Love and Hate, and it was made with everything that everyone around the table, and I think there were 80, all the foods they loved the most and all the foods they hated the most. And as it happens, stuff that people really enjoy, like artichokes and olives and mushrooms, are also things that people really can't stand, like olives, artichokes, and mushrooms, which are things that come about many times. And then started exploring a sense of ritual, having fun with what it is to have a table, what it is to eat around a table, what it is to use a tablecloth. And people would really participate in these in-the-mouth evenings, where we had I think the tablecloth is 150 foot long, and in between like each course, people would just like pull it, and then it was white, and then we'd start serving food on it again, and then it just, you know, goes on for 3 courses. So developing like a sense of physicality, a sense of participation, of community is really something that motivated me for this project specifically. Sometimes my work is going to be a bit different, where people are going to ask me, let's say, to do a table center, which is usually a vase with flowers, maybe a decoration. So in this sense, for me, it was kind of, we decided to do a vegan charcuterie and cheese plate. And somehow it ended up like this, and people had to work together in order to eat. And it was all based on different types of gestures and kind of like a personality casting around the table, where everybody was associated to a specific tool. So instead of sitting next to your boyfriend or your girlfriend or your friend and kind of like staying with the people you know, you had to sit at the place of, let's say, the elegant or the lazy person. And it was just like a bunch of adjectives, and each one had like a specific little tool that you had to use in order to make the food come alive at the table. So just kind of like breaking up people's like internal cassettes, like our way of being strangers with each other when we're in public spaces. That is something that I think about a lot, especially I think when we're in a city, when we live like in an urban setting. It's actually hard to make friends. It's hard to meet people, I find, you know, once you're out of school, and if like me, you don't really have an office space, and you know, you don't have the same faces day in and day out. It's like you don't, and especially with like social media and the fact that we're on the phones all the time, and we don't lift up our eyes, and it's kind of hard to meet people. So a lot of, you know, this kind of, it's always in my head whenever I think about my practice. This is another kind of more of a game, so kind of like the gamification of food. I call this the food Jenga. So basically a big structure filled with food, and that people have to basically break apart. They have to take all of the elements out. So if you need a glass, if you need a plate, you kind of have to take it in there. Of course, we don't want the food to fall, so there's always a bit of stress. But somehow it always works out whenever we do it. I haven't had no mess yet. Messes happen on workstations as people have to reassemble all the ingredients as plates. So basically, I'm saving on cooks and chefs because I get people to just do all the work. This time actually was pretty fun because the chefs were there, and they were kind of like, it was their signature dishes, so they were kind of like, all right, people, get to it. Like, you have to assign my signature dish and don't screw it up. So that was a pretty fun one too. In the last, I'd say, year, I've been playing with the concept of the electronic food orchestra. So playing more with like sensors and technology as a way to animate spaces and moments through the act of eating and drinking. So it's very haptic. This was the first generation. We're using sensors, and now we're already on a second generation of tables and weight scales and kind of like other objects that are made for food, but that are also made for people to kind of like turn places into something else through the act of eating and creating music kind of together and making it evolve throughout the evening. And sometimes there is no food. Sometimes it's more about really sensorial work. This is something that was presented at C2, I think 2 years ago, or last year. 2 years ago. No, last year. And basically it's augmented reality, where everything was about patterns, and it was about sensorial design and how we can view our environments differently. There was a scent machine, and basically a system inside that kind of, we used QR code technology and applied it to different patterns. So basically we created audio, visual, and scent layers depending on where you were looking in the room. If you're looking at the patterns of the plants or the fireplace, of the rug, of the mirror, you would see like different things changing the room. It was a bit of an acid trip. That's how most people described it, which is fun, turning a little leisurely walk in a living room into an acid trip. Are things that can happen in our everyday lives if we want to. We just have to want it. So just figured I'd do a little rundown on all these different things. That's why sometimes it's kind of hard for me to, describe what I do, because somehow I've turned into my own kind of like UFO. I get like really widely different calls from people for work, where sometimes they're like, oh, I can tell that they're attracted to something that I'm doing, but they don't really know what to ask me. And then it's always kind of interesting as well when they write the contracts, because they don't really know what to put in there. So sometimes I'll be hired as an artist, sometimes I'll be hired as like a caterer, sometimes I'll be hired, I don't know, as like an event producer, or it just, it goes all over the place. And at the beginning it was kind of hard for me because it's hard on the ego if you're somebody that wants to make art or wants to make high art or something like that, because that's not exactly what's happening, because it's like this kind of like jumbled mix, of I guess low art is what we would call it. And it took me a bit of time to kind of like get a sense of comfort of like being, well, it's okay, you don't know what to write on your business card, and you don't know exactly how you're going to be making a living, but somehow you're making a living and it's working out and people are calling you. They don't know what to ask, but then something happens, And then I started thinking kind of like where the sense of comfort with, this kind of like flow comes from, and I started associating it to how I grew up. I grew up in a super diverse neighborhood just outside of Montreal, and for me it was always kind of like natural to adapt myself to like different contexts and different people. So I learned like 3 languages at the same time, and sometimes the people that I would play the street with were like, they didn't speak any of those 3 languages. They would speak like other languages, but somehow would be able to play together. And so I have a sense of comfort in that context, and I'm less comfortable, I guess, when I'm in a room full of people that are all the same. And it's funny because I was looking for pictures and stuff like that for this conference, and I fell onto this picture, and this kind of like mirrors the way I work on a lot of projects today, which means that we'll often be around the table, and there's going to be me, well, my brother, is not at my meetings nowadays, but we talk on the phone a lot. Then there's going to be sometimes a choreographer. Then there's going to be like a creative technologist. Sometimes a florist has to come in because we want to have, I don't know, like honey dripping from, branches and flowers, that are hanging from the ceiling, let's say, like as those things happen. And then, the next meeting will be bringing in, let's say, like a composer. And then, we're going to need like a woodworker and things like that. So the teams are always kind of like constantly changing, which means that I'm always tapping into that kind of like, child that was learning those languages and everything, because the composer, doesn't know how to talk to a programmer, and the programmer doesn't necessarily know how to talk to the chef. The chef sure as hell doesn't know how to talk to most of the other people. So like in this world of variables where there's like all these different things, my one constant though is the food. And it took me years actually to kind of come to some type of like Proustian, origin moment where it was like the food, why the food? And people that have known me since like university will be like, well, of course, you're doing what you're doing. You used to put like insane amounts of food into almost every scene in your short films already. So this thing has been kind of like there. It's it's been in the back of my mind for a long time, and I knew that it was like this matter, this media that I found expressive. I just didn't know how or when, or and it took me a long time to just be like, screw it. I'm just gonna play with it and put it out there and see what happens, when people start playing with it and with me as well. But I'd say that all this kind of like, I don't know if it's an obsession, I guess I call it like a plural fixation with food, really comes from my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, Mario, who is, that really is him. So he is it was him actually. So he basically spent most of his time as an agriculture in northern Portugal, which is where most of my family is from. And in a 90-person village, a man of great general culture, not a lot of education, formal education, but just immense culture, and also a man of many stories. He was actually like widely known in the region, not just like in that village or around the villages. Sometimes it would be like 100 kilometers away, and people would be like, so who do you belong to? And I'd be like, well, I'm so-and-so's son, and Mario is my grandfather, and be like, oh, Mario's your grandfather. It's like there was like all these stories about him. So he's really the one that gave me a love for fiction, because he was like this Fellini-esque character when I was growing up. But then, he spent most of his time working. This was him he had 3 vineyards, so made his living from cultivating grapes for wine, for Porto, and then for, different markets. He would be selling them in, different markets. And then he would grow most of his food. There were animals. So he had like this very real relationship to food, which was not at all the relationship to food that I had growing up in Brassard, like at the beginning of the 80s. And I don't know if anybody over here was, in suburbia at the beginning of the 80s, but supermarkets were really a sad thing. Like, the fresh vegetable and fruit aisle was just, things, basically everything tasted the same. The apple tasted the same as the peach, tasted the same as the nectarine, tasted the same as the tomato, tasted the same as the cucumber, which means it just didn't taste like anything. So what happened is that every time we would do something, whether it was, let's say, helping him out, out in the field, or going to visit a castle, or going somewhere, the first question out of my grandfather's mouth was always, yeah, but what are we going to eat? And it's not that he was like this insatiably hungry man. It's just that he was really interested in like everything that was behind the food. It would always be like, if we're going to like this village, we have to eat like this suckling pig because that's the way they've been doing it for years. And if we go to like downtown, there's this old woman who still makes this like pastry, same recipe from like the Dark Ages, and it has to happen, like we have to have that. And then let's say it's like, oh, this peach is like super ripe, so we have to go to like this orchard and everything. So food and meals were always kind of like these open books with narratives that had like personal narratives and that had more collective narratives, be it the story of like a family, the story of like a region, or some broader identity that's linked to, I don't know, like a country or what have you. And then there was like all these personal narratives of, the people who were making it, who were growing it, and what have you. And then there was that, but there was also the fact that he loved meeting people around meals. And I always like to say that for him, like tables were the first internet. In the sense that that's the way that he got to know other people, he got to know other cultures, was like through the sharing of his food. That's just how he had a foot into the outside world, because he was living in a 90-person village, only spoke Portuguese, and of course he would read the papers, and he was always reading books as well, but he got access to, I don't know, like people's experiences from the outside world, from like other countries, only through tables, for like sharing meals or going to cafes and seeing how people interacted with the food. Like he was always wondering if people were, you know, like good eaters or not and stuff like that. And then of all the conversations that, you know, he strikes, and would see how people's perspectives changed around like the same plate of food. Like the reactions were just completely different depending on where you're from and who you are. And I don't know what he, you know, thought of me, because I was a super finicky eater back then, when I was a kid. So as I go through this kind of like Proustian detour, what I want to fall upon is this concept that is the concept of culture. Because basically what my grandfather was touching upon was food as culture, and not, you know, we're used to talking about culture as, well, you know, it's theater, it's TV, it's film, it's literature, and we talk about formats a lot more than we talk about the air that's between you and I, which is kind of like, for me, the real definition of culture. It's what's happening kind of like between us. And it's not finite. It's you know, it's immaterial, and it's hard to get a hold of. So let's do a little exercise. So let's see what the meaning of this is for you guys. Anybody want to tell me what you see if I tell you you're not allowed to say tomato?
Pizza.
Pizza?
Sun.
The sun? Okay.
Time boxing. Time box.
Time box? Okay. Yes.
Italy.
Italy, okay, very interesting. Actually, my friend Melissa, who's Italian, like this is a big part of her Italianness. She's still, she will still, you know, do I don't know how many jars of like tomatoes with her family like every fall. But oddly enough, the other answer to Italianness about the tomatoes, that's a story of colonization,
Because it's from Mexico.
it's from the Americas. So, right on, sister. So it's a story of colonization because it is from Mexico, from the Americas, and it was brought into Europe, I don't know, maybe, what, like 400 years ago or 300? But it's only been eaten actually for like 300 years. It wasn't even eaten that much in the Americas because it's part of the nightshades. If you actually eat the leaves or the stems of tomato, you could die from poisoning. So humans naturally stayed away from the fruit because they thought it was poisonous as well. Anybody else want to talk about the immateriality of tomatoes?
Summer.
Summer, yes, season, seasonality.
A really good sandwich.
A really good sandwich, yes. So, like memories about things that include tomatoes. There's like, it's fun, my mom didn't eat tomatoes for like, it's like 15 years because she was really into those bogus diets in the 80s. She did the Scarsdale diet for like years, and her lunch was actually 3 tomatoes, and she wasn't even allowed to put salt on them. She could only put pepper. So she didn't eat them for years after that. Yeah. Loneliness? The loneliness of a tomato? Yeah. You have to expand for us now. There you go. Better in groups.
Yeah, I saw a couple and a single.
There you go.
It's just the way they play.
So this is, so like this, what's happening here is what I really like, you know, enjoy, and is really like what's at the heart, basically, of my work. I'm often disappointed in the way that people talk about food in terms of like articles, let's say, or even like journals, and because it's always kind of like in silos. So it's often like, well, food as health, food as nutrition, food as, beauty, let's say, or food as sustainability, food as environment. And oddly enough, the culture of food was lost on a lot of people, especially in North America, with the advent of industrialization. What my grandfather, what I had access to, let's say with my grandfather, the fact that he was close to his food and that food was really something that was cultural and that it could express culture, is something that a lot of people didn't grow up with, especially in urban areas, because we have been meeting food through the eyes of corporations and through the eyes of industry, which means that through the industrialization of food, the fact that, let's say, even farmers are growing monocrops, like just large crops of oneness, means that people who are even living outside of cities don't have access to a wide variety of foods. The fact that everything is produced in industries and then marketed to us means that we got to meet food through the eyes of marketing, as opposed to meeting it through the eyes of culture. I find that right now we still have these remnants when we talk about food in silos, or we talk about diets and health and gluten, no gluten, and all of that stuff. And by the way, it's great that people take control of their own diets and that they own whatever they want to own. But at the same time, I can't help but to think that in order to deal with all of the challenges about food and about all of these silos, about the challenges of nutrition, about the challenges of sustainability, is that we somehow have to connect all of them through culture. And I often ask myself, because I'll tell you what my pet peeve is, all those things about the future of food. It's that's really when I'm okay, so it's this thing that you're growing in a lab is going to fix, all of humanity because, and then it's okay, but it's packaged and nobody's looking at the packaging and stuff like that, and somehow it's still disconnected. It's still not telling the story of us, and it's still not creating a moment where we can meet the food and where we can have a sense of collectivity as well, where all of a sudden this food can start meaning something for us and become meaningful. So for me, this idea, this idea of culture is kind of central because figured I gave all that space to my grandfather, so I might as well get my grandma in there. My grandma is kind of the other person that really influenced me with food because she was there most of the time when my brother and I came from school, and she's the one that actually taught me how to cook and taught me how to do some things with food, because as much as my grandfather, had this hugely, I'll say conceptual, relationship to food, he couldn't cook for the life of him. He could do a lot of things with his hands. He was a great mechanic, he was an agricultural, he could grow food, but as soon as food came into a kitchen, he couldn't even fry an egg, literally. He never made anything for himself, ever. And so the other side of things is my grandmother, who kind of gave me all of the know-how and kind of the empowerment that you can use food, you can make food do whatever you want it to do as well. And so in that sense, that came with a sense of empowerment. And I think when I think of all this kind of flowing that I do of of course, maybe, can we put a sensor in the food? Sure, yeah. Can we program the food to play music? Yeah, we can do that. Can I make, 100 people believe that, this slice of pizza or this lasagna is telling the story about themselves? Yeah, we can do it. We can do all of that. And so that kind of zaniness or craziness or the fact that I think of food as something that is infinite really comes from this woman who, it came from having to stretch the food for like a family because we're of small means, but at the same time, I guess it was kind of like this capacity to make things with food combined with like this conceptual thought of food that somehow made this kind of like sense of flow regarding food. So I'll just kind of like touch upon the fact that as we live in kind of these are kind of like strange times in the sense that the concept, for me anyways, in the sense that I tend to think of things in terms of culture, and culture is not something. It's not something that is. It's not something that is being discussed. Like if we read like articles in the papers or even like it happens a bit more in radio, but like the cultural lens to understand things is not something that's in fashion. It's like we're constantly pushed towards opinion and towards like the black and the white, and every time we try to position ourselves in like the gray and the green and the pink and the yellow that are in between the black and the white, there's always like this force that keeps like pushing us towards like one an extreme, and which means that I find it like it's hard on us like socially, and it's just hard on us like personally. Anyways, it's hard on me. I don't have to speak to for all of you guys. And I think one of the things that I do seek whenever I present like these projects or events or installations or participatory things, whatever we want to call them, is that I do think that they help to kind of like bring us together and to not start conversations by, what's your name, what do you do, where you're from. Sometimes I'll have like people, talking about how they grew up, and how, let's say like their family was like really poor and they ate exactly the same thing when they came home from school, and they're saying this to a complete stranger without even knowing their first name. And somehow, we start to like gain a bit more of our humanity back whenever I see this happening, and that's really like what motivates me at the end of the day of all my practice. I think the best compliment ever I got was, it was 5 years ago, the first time I did like the In the Mouth series at the Phi Center, and then like I think it was like 2 or 3 years later, I was just minding my own business on St. Lawrence Street, and somebody like just stopped me and they're like, you're Nico. I was like, yeah. And she's like, I went to your event, like to In the Mouth. And she's like, I made new friends. As a matter of fact, I'm on my way now to Majestic to meet with them. Like we hang out. We didn't know each other before. And it's like, it sparked a great friendship. I was like, wow. That's like exactly everything that I've wanted to do. So, although I don't think we'll get world peace through a messy dinner, I do think it's interesting to see how people interact with dripping sauce from the side of the table. And I don't think there's any wrong way to react to dripping sauce on the side of the table. And I think that a messy dinner about world peace would be something that I would want to go to.